My name is David Madison, the 2nd of January 2021. I was a Methodist minister for 9 years, but by the time I finished my PhD in biblical studies, my belief in God had evaporated. If you study the Bible too closely, too carefully, its errors and flaws become all too obvious. In this series of videos, Bible Blunders and Bad Theology, I will discuss a lot of them. This is episode 22. The Apostle Paul was the first person we know of to write about Jesus, but then decades later, the Gospel writers came along and wrote their narratives. We know them now as the four Gospels. They did this to advance the cause of the tiny Jesus sect. There was keen anticipation that the kingdom of God would arrive soon to replace earthly governments. Who would need Gospels after that? The last thing that these writers could have imagined was that their Jesus stories would still be read 2,000 years later, and that every word they wrote would be closely scrutinized by thousands of scholars, and that all the flaws and inventions, note the word inventions, would be discovered as well. When Matthew copied most of Mark's gospel, he felt he needed to make a big correction. There is little ethical teaching in Mark's gospel, so Matthew added this Sermon on the Mount. So for centuries, Christians have assumed that these are the actual words of Jesus. But how could the original words of Jesus, how could they have been preserved? There were no stenographers, no recording machines, and most of the people who heard Jesus preach were illiterate. They wouldn't have carried around pads of paper and pencil anyway. Well, it turns out that these aren't the words of Jesus at all. One of the top Jesus scholars of our time, Richard Carrier, has written, quote, "The Sermon on the Mount is a well-crafted literary work that cannot have come from some illiterate Galilean," unquote. Literary work, that is, it originated in written form. Is it unfair to call Jesus an illiterate Galilean? Well, there is no way at all to verify that Jesus could actually read. Carrier goes on to say this about the Sermon on the Mount, quote, "We know that it originated in Greek, not Hebrew or Aramaic, because it relies on the Septuagint text of the Bible for all of its features and allusions. It relies exclusively on the Greek text of Deuteronomy and Leviticus especially. These are not the words of Jesus. This famous sermon as a whole has a complex literary structure that can only have come from a writer, not an everyday speaker," unquote. For Carrier's careful analysis of the Sermon on the Mount, see his book On the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt. Matthew, of course, didn't realize that this would be considered a big blunder, that is, passing off a literary work as the real words of Jesus. He had no clue that smart scholars, well trained in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, would one day, 2,000 years in the future, figure out what he had done. After all, in the ancient world, it was common practice. It was okay to make up speeches for heroes when telling their stories. By the way, when Luke saw Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, he changed the wording. He deleted some of it. He shortened it. He had no problem tampering with the supposed words of Jesus. And he also said that it took place on a plain, not on a mount. The author of John's Gospel thought the famous sermon wasn't worth it at all. He left it out altogether, but then went wildly overboard, inventing other Jesus speeches. So the blunders just keep piling on.